Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'll just tell you, everyone, our format. Professor Balkin is going to present his remarks, and then we'll have a Q&A. And what would be wonderful from our panelists and moderators is if your cameras are off during Professor Balkin's talk, that's fine. When he's done and it's time for Q&A, if you could turn your cameras back on so everyone can see you and we can engage in conversation, all of us, that would be fantastic. And if you do have a Q&A, anybody in the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So it's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, the author of The Cycles of Constitutional Time, Jack Balkin. Professor Balkin is the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment at Yale Law School. He is the founder and director of Yale's Information Society Project, an interdisciplinary center that studies law and new information technologies. He also directs the Abrams Institute for Freedom of Expression and the Knight Law and Media program at Yale. Professor Balkin received his PhD in philosophy from Cambridge University, his bachelor's and JD degrees from Harvard University. He served as law clerk to the Honorable Carolyn King of the Fifth Circuit. He practiced at Cravath and Swain in New York before joining the Legal Academy. He's been a member of the law faculties at the University of Texas, UMKC, and as I mentioned, he's a native of Kansas City. He's been a visiting professor at Harvard, NYU, Tel Aviv, the University of London. Professor Balkin is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the author of over 100 articles in different fields, including constitutional theory, internet law, freedom of speech, reproductive rights, jurisprudence, and the theory of ideology. He founded and edits a very popular blog called Balkanization and has written widely on legal issues for numerous publications. He has also written or edited about a dozen books, their subjects ranging from constitutional interpretation and constitutional legitimacy to our political system, to cybercrime and its prevention. And as Frank Bowman remarked earlier, Professor is both a public intellectual and a scholar of the highest rank, and I am so pleased to welcome him, though virtually, to Mizzou Law to deliver the keynote address to our Law Reviews Symposium. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. First of all, I want to thank you, Paul, for all the work you did organizing this. I want to thank Dean Lidsky. It's great to be back. It's great to see you. Thanks to the Law Review and to everyone at Mizzou. It's really great to be back in my home state. This has been just enormous joy, and I hope you guys have enjoyed it, even slightly a little bit as much as I've enjoyed it, because it's just been a blast for me. And I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm grateful you put this on. So I'm going to talk about the issues in this book according to the three different parts of this conference. That's how I thought I would organize it, but I'm going to organize it in a slightly different order. First, I'm going to talk about constitutional politics. Then I'm going to talk about constitutional design. And finally, I'm going to talk about constitutional history. Constitutional politics was the last of our three sessions. And I'm going to focus primarily, because I'll get to Amanda's remarks a little bit later when I talk about design. I'm going to focus primarily on what Guy had to say, because Guy inspired me to give a mini homily, a little mini lecture within the lecture about the relationship of the thesis of the book to race. Now, Guy is correct in one sense. There's no chapter on race in the book. Race appears in many places in the book, but it's not one of the central organizing ideas in the book. But it's everywhere in the book. I mean, that's very important to understand. It's in the background of everything I say. Let me just give you a couple of examples. At one point, I point out that the United States has been in a position of increasing rot for the last 40 years. And Guy said, well, how can that be? Because after all, you have the Voting Rights Act in '65 and the Great Civil Rights Acts. So how can you say we've been in a period of rot for the past 40 years? Well, if you subtract a 40 from 2020, you don't get 1965, you get 1980. And there's a big difference between 1965 and 1980. 1965 is the heyday of the New Deal civil rights regime. And then 1980 is the beginning of the retrenchment, which comes with the Reagan regime, increasing polarization, increasingly about issues of race and identity, and also retrenchment with respect to issues of economic inequality. So the choice of 40 is not a random number. It actually is distinguishing between the period of the Civil Rights Acts and what comes afterwards. Here's the second example, and that's about race, you see. Here's a second example. I point out at the very end of the book that it's possible to imagine a populist coalition between the populist side of the Democratic Party and the populist side of the Republican Party. But I also point out that there's a limit to this, and it will depend greatly on whether or not the redistributive legislation and the public goods programs that are created can be presented as deracialized. Because if these reforms are treated as racialized, a point that Guy, among others, made in the last session, that will prevent coalitions from forming. Race polarizes and undermines laws that create public goods if they're seen as not merely redistributional, but redistributional in a way that distributes from one race to another, from whites to blacks. So the issue of race is in many different places in the book, but Guy inspired me to suggest to you that it might be very useful and interesting intellectually if I retold the entire story of the book using race as the central concept. And what would the story of the book look like if we foregrounded race? Well, remember, there are three different cycles in the book. There are cycles of the rise and fall of regimes. There are cycles of polarization and depolarization, and there are cycles of rot and renewal. More correctly, I would say episodes of rot, followed by episodes of renewal. So how would this look from the standpoint of race if we treated race as the central organizing principle of the book? Well, the first thing you would note is that in each successive regime, race and attitudes about race turn out to be central to the formation of the regime and the dominant coalition. So just to take an example, when Thomas Jefferson wins the 1800 election, it's pointed out by the followers of John Adams that he does so on the backs of slaves. And the reason is that the 3/5 rule is central to the ability of the new Republican Party, Democratic Republican Party, to win an electoral college majority. And if you hadn't had the 3/5 rule, then in fact you wouldn't have the Jeffersonian regime. And once the Jeffersonian regime is in power, then of course the 3/5 rule is extremely important in deciding who becomes president and also what the political decisions of that regime are. This becomes even more important as we move from the Jeffersonian regime into the next regime, which is the Jacksonian regime. And Saul Cornell has a new book out about the Jacksonian regime. And one of the central points in this book is the idea that the Jacksonian regime is able to promote the interests of the ordinary working white man through a simultaneous exclusion of women and also minorities, so that the Jacksonian regime and its governing coalition, its opposition between the party of democracy, which is the Jacksonians, and the elites, which refers to the Whigs, that opposition is made possible by a racially exclusionary politics, and a politics which basically it eventually becomes captive to the slave power. And in fact, one of the first episodes, key episodes of Rot, in the book, the 1850s, is the period in which the slave power has essentially taken over American politics. And the rise of the Republican Party in 1854 is an attempt to try to meet the rot that's caused by the dominance of the slave power in American politics. And the slave power, I won't go into the details here, but essentially what the slave power does is it makes it very, very hard for ordinary working people and farmers to compete with slave owners. And it does so, and the reason why they're able to have this dominance in the economy is because, like Jefferson, they're doing it on the backs of slaves. That is to say, it's a racialized economy that basically empowers a particular group to take over the economy and then take over politics. There's a lot of literature on this, which I won't go into, but that's basically the story. Well, the next regime is the regime of the Republican Party. And that regime can also be understood, and its governing coalition can be also understood through the question of race. Early on, it looks like this is a regime that is going to be a multiracial coalition. It's going to be a coalition of whites and blacks, and it's going to be the party of the Union. And indeed, the reason you get the 15th Amendment so soon after it's thought impossible to give blacks the vote. In 1866, the right to vote is excluded from the 14th Amendment, except to a certain extent in Section 2, because it's just thought to be political suicide to push for black suffrage. But as a result of congressional reconstruction and the requirement that states create new constitutional conventions, that is, states in the South, which allow blacks to vote, that consequence fundamentally changes the political calculations of Republican politicians. And so by 1870, it's possible actually to get the 15th Amendment through. So the new coalition looks like a multiracial coalition, but it soon becomes quite clear, for reasons that Mark Graber in his new book on the 14th Amendment explains, that this multiracial coalition will not be successful. The reason it won't be successful is because of enormous resistance and terrorism in the defeated South. So if you think massive resistance after Brown versus Board of Education was a problem, well, it's nothing in comparison to the resistance that you get in the old Confederacy in the period of following Appomattox, but as Sandy Levinson would point out, not the end of the Civil War. And so as a result, the multiracial coalition, which looks like to be the basis of the new Republican Party, eventually is not adequate, and therefore the Republican Party shifts. And this takes us into the years of the First Gilded Age, and it takes us into the period in which the Republican Party moves from a multiracial coalition devoted to the freedom of African Americans into a coalition that's primarily about the protection of corporate interests. So that by the time you get to 1897 in Algier versus Louisiana, the 14th Amendment, which was originally designed to protect the civil freedoms of African Americans, now protects the civil freedoms of railroads and corporations. One of the many ironies in history. So the Republican regime of from the 1860s onward is a regime which is very much constructed by issues of race, and the form of politics of this period, the polarization of this period, is also affected by the politics of race. I'll get back to that point in a second. When we move from the into the New Deal, the New Deal regime works through the advantage of depolarization, which begins in the 1890s. And that, in turn, has to do with the way in which the rates of immigration in the United States are slowed, as well as the excesses of the Gilded Age. The new coalition of the New Deal, the coalition which makes many different kinds of reforms possible, again, is only made possible by a form of compromise in which Northern liberal Democrats ally with Southern Democrats. They agree on questions of class, but they disagree on questions of identity and especially questions of race. And it's that bargain, that compromise, that makes that particular coalition work. There's much more to say about this, but just to move forward on the question of regimes, as we move in 1896 from a politics organized around identity and race to about 1932 with a politics that's organized primarily about class and economic issues. That is a very successful coalition that proceeds through the middle of the 20th century, but eventually Northern liberals in the Democratic Party and their allies in the Republican Party eventually decide, as a result of World War II and the direct action phase of the civil rights movement, that they have to do something about the inequalities, the racial inequalities in American society. And that produces the Civil Rights era and the Great Civil Rights Acts. One of the effects of the Great Civil Rights Acts, however, is that it slowly and then later quickly fractures and destroys the New Deal coalition. The compromise between Northern liberal Democrats and Southern Democrats can't hold on much longer, and eventually it gives way, leading to the realignment of the parties, caused once again by issues of race. And as we move into the Reagan regime, which is from 1980 onward, as I pointed out in my earlier remarks, the Reagan regime is organized by the successful strategy of the Republican Party to become a national dominant party through a strategy of political polarization. And race plays an important story in that successful strategy of political polarization, a point that's made with great candor by Stuart Stevens in his recent book called It Was All a Lie, about his efforts as a Republican political strategist and operative. So as we get to the end of the Reagan regime, what we see is the ne plus ultra, if you will, of the strategy of racial polarization, and that's in the form of a racist demagogue, which is Donald Trump. Okay, I just told the story of regimes from the standpoint of race. Now I can tell the story of polarization too from the standpoint of race, but I can tell it actually much more quickly. And here's the reason why. If you, the modern party system starts around the time of the Civil War, with Democrats and Republicans as the two major parties. Those parties are defined by the Civil War, the memory of the Civil War, and also by race. Polarization continues through around 1896 or so, and then it starts to decline. But part of the reason it declines is because the Republicans give up on protecting Black civil rights, and especially Black voting rights. Their last major attempt is in the 1890s, the failure of the Force Bill, the Lodge Bill. And then after that, they more or less give up. And that then leads to a new accommodation, which is at the sacrifice of African Americans, and in which you get renewed acceptance of the most vicious forms of racism. This is a period in which the second version of the Klan is on the rise. This is a period in which Woodrow Wilson screens birth of a nation at the White House. It's a period in the 1920s, the progressive era, in which the Klan is dominant in Indiana and Oregon. There's a march in Washington of Klansmen. And so part of the cost of depolarization is this Faustian bargain over the issue of race. And then the New Deal coalition is ultimately unravels, the point I made before, because of the reforms of the civil rights era. And the Republican Party figures out how to break apart the New Deal coalition through polarization strategies, which include not only cultural issues, but also race. Okay, so that's the story of polarization through the lens of race. Now let me finally tell you the story of constitutional rot through the lens of race. And here, the story is also going to be very familiar. If we look at the key episodes and the key areas of rot in American history, the first is the 1850s. That's the dominance of the slave power. And that dominance is made possible because of a particular form of racialized capitalism, that is slavery. Is we moved from through the 1870s, 80s, and 90s to the second regime, a period of rot. That's the end of the Gilded Age. That also has a great deal to do with race because Republicans and Democrats are in a very close set of presidential elections. They're highly competitive. And one of the key issues of that period is the question of race in the memory of the Civil War. The Republicans famously waved the bloody shirt to try to win victories over the Democrats. And then as we move into the third arena of constitutional rot, that is the period from around 1980 to the present, this also is tied to polarization strategies, which are tied to race. So, and I could write this up as a separate little lecture, you see. I mean, I could expand on what I just said here. You could do the entire story of this book using race as the central concept, and the logics would still be the same, and many of the features of the argument would still be the same, but it would highlight the role that race plays at each part of the argument. So Guy has, as I hoped he would, because he's always really helpful in me thinking about my ideas, Guy has in fact inspired me to do this. And I have to write something for the Missouri Law Review. And so whatever I write for the Missouri Law Review, maybe in fact, I'll make this either the whole lecture, or maybe I'll make it the first half of the lecture. So anyway, that's the first thing I want to say about constitutional politics. You can organize the whole argument of the book through the lens of race. Okay. Now, here's the second thing I want to say, or rather, here's the kicker to what I want to say. At the very end of the book, in chapter 12, I mention the possibility that the next dominant coalition, the next coalition, which will probably be the coalition of the Democratic Party, is likely to be a multiracial coalition. And we've never really had an effective multiracial coalition before in the nation's history. The closest we came, as I said before, is the early years of the Republican coalition in the 1860s and 70s, and that did not last for reasons I described. And that, I think, will have significant effects on the forms of politics. Another thing that I think people don't quite understand, or to the extent they understand it, they're upset about it, is the fact that Donald Trump seems to have been able to attract not a large number, but a fair number of votes from Latinos and African Americans in the last election, which suggests that the Republican Party, as it reforms in this new era, will probably have more racial minorities. Now, for many liberals and Democrats, that is very upsetting because in their view, the Republican Party has not been very good to racial minorities. But to the extent that both parties have a significant share of African Americans and Latinos in them, that will also conduce to depolarization, because both parties will find that they have to do something to appeal to these groups within their parties. So it won't be perfect, but in fact, the combination of the fact the dominant coalition will be multiracial and the fact that the Republican Party, in order to survive, will have to continue to attract more Latinos and African Americans may actually be a good thing in the long run, even though in the short run, it's very distressing to many Democrats and liberals. And if that's so, what I'm calling the second progressive era in the book could also be a third Reconstruction. Okay. The next thing I want to say about politics is actually going to be about Jonathan Ginop's paper. And it's not, although he spoke in the history panel, what I want to say has to do with politics. Jonathan pointed out that another really important element in rot is the loss of civic virtue. And he argued that might even be a fourth cycle. In my view, what Jonathan is explaining is not a fourth cycle. It is integral to the very idea of constitutional rot and also to the idea of trust. So the idea of civic virtue, of forbearance, of recognizing that your political opponents are not enemies to be destroyed, but rather fellow citizens you have to cooperate and work with, is tied to the idea of trust. In other words, when I speak of the role of trust in as a casualty of constitutional rot, many of the things that Jonathan is talking about are precisely what I have in mind. And to this, Jonathan has added an additional factor, which is the role of civic education. I would say not education so much as acculturation. That is, creating a particular kind of culture in which people understand their fellow citizens as fellow citizens and not simply enemies to be destroyed. How do you restore this kind of trust, this kind of forbearance? Well, the answer is you have to change the conditions of politics. I'll return to this at the end of the talk, but I want to point out one interesting irony. The 1890s, which I see in this book as being very similar to our own day, are a period of intense political competition between the two parties. And one of the ironies of the period after the 1896 election, with McKinley's victory and then later Roosevelt's, is that the Republican Party starts to wipe the floor with the Democratic Party in the elections that follow, with the exception, of course, of Wilson's election in 1912 and then 1916. 1912, he gets in because the Republican vote is split, and in 1916, he gets in a fairly close election. But otherwise, the Republican Party truly is dominant. Now, what's interesting about this, and it's very ironic, is that when you have a system in which one party is clearly dominant and the other is really rarely has that same degree of power, you tend to get depolarization, because basically you get a much more of a live and let live arrangement between politicians of the two parties. On the other hand, in the Gilded Age, the first part of the Gilded Age, up to the 1890s, when the parties are equally competitive and highly competitive, and two of the presidential elections involve a situation in which the Electoral College winner does not win the popular vote. They're that competitive. The parties are each other's throats, and there's very little trust, very little accommodation, and a loss of civic virtue. So although this isn't by itself a cure to our problems, if we move into a period in which one of the parties becomes clearly dominant, then we are likely to see, ironically or not, some degree of restoration of trust and accommodation, the kind we do not see today, precisely because the parties are really very equally matched and very competitive. I'll talk about this a little more at the end of the talk. Now I want to move on to the second big topic in this talk, and that's the issue of constitutional design. In the first panel, Tommy pointed out that it's very strange that the book has no normative proposals, except for, I mentioned this business about the Supreme Court, and Sam Moyne pointed out that was very strange, since why am I talking about the Supreme Court? Since, you know, most of the book is orthogonal to the question of the Supreme Court, and that's very fair. But I should explain what's going on. I wrote this very long second part of the book about judicial politics, and I wanted to suggest what, in fact, you could do if you wanted to lower the stakes of judicial appointments, and so that's why I discussed it. But I don't believe that the central reforms that are necessary to solve the constitutional rot in the United States or polarization in the United States will come from judicial reform. In fact, I state very clearly in the book that the judiciary is the last place you'd want to look for trying to get the United States out of constitutional rot. I say that every little bit helps, but the reason that's included in the book is simply because of the question of what I saw as being, and it turned out to be the case, a renewed interest in court reform as a result of the cycles, the end of the Republican cycle and increasing polarization and constitutional rot. So if you actually want to see what my proposals for reform are in the book, they're not in this book, they're in my last book, which is Democracy and Dysfunction, which was co-authored with my dear friend Sandy Levinson. And that's why I'm going to discuss this idea when we get to the second part, which is about design. Now, the big debate in that book, so you can understand where Sandy and I are coming from, is a general agreement that there's something deeply wrong with American politics, and a disagreement about what to do about it. Sandy's position, which is also the position he articulated here, is that what we need is a new set of amendments and possibly a new constitutional convention. Whereas the position I take in that book, and which I continue to hold to this day, is that although I'm not opposed to amendment, I think amendment's fine. I'm not one of those people who thinks, oh, we should never amend the Constitution. It's just that I think that amendment is very hard to achieve in the United States. On this, Sandy and I both agree. And that there are plenty of workarounds that could make our situation better through legislation, through changes in practices, and through changes in judicial doctrine. So that was one of the big debates in the book. And it's still a disagreement that Sandy and I have, but we're both committed to the idea of constitutional reform. And it's also my view, by the way, that this next regime, whenever it occurs, this second progressive era, is going to be a period of constitutional creativity and reform, although it'll probably start in the states, where it's easier to amend the Constitution and only later appear in the federal Constitution. And that, in fact, also is what happened in the first progressive era. The key point I'd make about constitutional design, and it's tied to the debate that Sandy and I have been having for a number of years, is that proposals for constitutional reform, the rise of such proposals and the success of such proposals is not exogenous to the cycles that I have described in this book. What I mean is, there's a reason why proposals for constitutional reform arise at certain points in history. They have to do with the cycles I describe in the book. And their success has something to do with whether or not you're at a particular point in history in which they're likely to be successful. So it's no accident that the progressive era amendments, the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th, all occur during a period of relative depolarization. That's also true of the 20th. And in a period of high polarization and high constitutional rot, there is enormous desire for constitutional reform. Sandy is exemplary on this respect, but it's very hard to achieve constitutional reform through amendment, precisely because of the intense partisan polarization and the fact that the parties are each other's throats and therefore won't cooperate with each other. And so I say to Sandy, you know, it might be good if we had a bunch of amendments, but good luck getting those amendments through in periods of high polarization, and good luck getting a new constitutional convention called and having it be successful in a period like this. If you want constitutional reforms along the line that Sandy suggests, and I think some of them would be very good ideas, what you need is a change in the forms of politics, and that requires mobilization, destruction, and renewal, as I'll talk about a little later. Constitutional reform, as I said before, is likely to start in the states, and that's where you should start. You should get people interested in the question of constitutional reform by first starting with state constitutions, And that's another reason to go back to the discussion that Aaron had, why states are just so very, very important. They're important both as locuses of counterpower. They're important as bargainers with the federal government. So I have a slightly different view than the book she was mentioning. But they're also important because they're places in which you can actually get constitutional reforms done. There are also places, and Sandy is delighted by this, in which you can have something closer to direct democracy. You can have initiative and referendum. Many of these things happen and get started during the first progressive era. So that's what I would suggest. Anyone, focus on states. And often what happens is what happens in the states then bubbles up and affects national politics. Okay, so my view, which is how I differ from Sandy, is that most important constitutional reforms that we can actually do in the next 10, 20 years are likely going to happen through constitutional workarounds and through legislation. Here are a few of the proposals I made. I made lots and lots and lots of them in the previous book, and I don't want to bore you with all the details, but just to give you a sense of what you might do if you wanted to improve our constitutional system through constitutional workarounds. So we need a new Voting Rights Act. We need to give incentives for states, either economic or otherwise, to update their voting systems and have modern forms of voting security. We need to encourage states to create nonpartisan electoral commissions, electoral agencies. Many of them already started to do this. Election administration should be nonpartisan. It can still be at the state level. It doesn't have to be federalized as long as it's nonpartisan and expertise driven. We should add new states to deal with that malapportionment. I tend to agree with Sandy that the Senate is one of the biggest problems we face. It's going to be very difficult to get rid of the Senate. Even with an amendment, it may be difficult to get rid of the Senate because of the way Article 5 is written. The best way to deal with Senate malapportionment is to add new states. You should immediately add DC and Puerto Rico. In fact, I am perfectly open to making new states out of old states, even if this increased the number of Republicans in the Senate. Because I think in the long run, what matters is a less malapportioned Senate and not the particular political arrangement that we have right now, because that will change over time. If you're worried about the Electoral College, there are at least two different reforms you could adopt. One is the National Popular Vote Compact, which awards the electoral votes of the states that enter it to whoever wins the popular vote or the plurality. Another possibility is using ranked choice voting in each state, which basically solves many of the problems of the Electoral College because third parties don't skew the results. So for example, if you had ranked choice voting in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in 2016, Hillary Clinton probably would have won the election. You can repeal the single member district requirement in the House of Representatives and move to ranked choice voting there. That will have all sorts of salutary effects. It will make more than one party possible. It will also have the effect of decreasing polarization. And so, again, these things are shaped by the institutions that you create. From the standpoint of issues of rot, we should have tax reform. We should have increased antitrust and competition law. We should have reforms to lobby and campaign finance. We should have continuity in government acts. We should certainly change the rules that have been abused by the Trump administration for acting officials who don't have to have Senate confirmation. And we should use what remains of the power to have independent federal agencies to create a Department of Public Prosecutions to deal with corruption in the executive branch. We should make digital businesses information fiduciaries. I've written about this, require public interest obligations in return for Section 230 immunity. We could create an expanded public media system with a public option for social media. Ethan Zuckerman has made many interesting suggestions along these lines. I could do a whole lecture on that, but I have to keep going. And then that finally takes us to court reform, which is important for all these other things, because if courts strike down these things, then what was the point of passing them? That's what happened to the Voting Rights Act. Which takes me to the idea of reforming the federal judiciary. Now, here we get to Sam Moyne's points and also to Amanda's points. Sam says, I thought it was very amusing when he said it, that he's not an opponent of judicial review. And I thought that was a very funny thing for him to say, because he is the foremost proponent of weakening judicial review, that is democratizing it and making it less important. So it's a little like Donald Trump saying he's never been opposed to Obamacare. It's not quite true. Anyway, but Sam is going in an important direction. It's a direction that many people who've engaged in court reform are not going, which is he's saying, look, the first question to ask is not how you want to reform the court, it's what values you're trying to serve. And Sam's point is you should make judicial review more consistent with democracy. And that means making it less powerful and less important. And that's why he proposes the reforms he proposes. The only problem from my standpoint with this is I think you have to reckon with the fact that there are institutions there and there are institutional incentives. And that the reason the judicial review has become so strong is because American politicians in each generation have wanted it this way. And that occasionally they threaten to remove strip the court's jurisdiction and do other things, but they never do. And the reason they never do it is because politicians find judicial review an extremely valuable feature of American politics. So if you want to weaken it or democratize it, you have to reshape the incentives of politicians. I think that Sam, my dear colleague, is the greatest optimist of all of us at this conference. And the reason why he's the greatest optimist is because he views the structures and institutions of American politics as far more plastic and contingent than I think the rest of us do. But if you want radical change, which is the kind of change he wants, this is precisely the kind of hope you have to have and precisely the kind of attitude you have to have about institutions and structures. I'll return to that point a little bit later. My own views are a bit more evolutionary and path dependent in this respect, but as a fellow optimist, I can only say game recognized game. Now, I agree with Amanda Hollis-Brisky in almost every respect of what she said. She points out how the process has become heavily politicized. My proposal for judicial reform, which creates rotation in an appellate panel while all justices serve in the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, is designed to lean into the political features of judicial review rather than trying to eliminate them as Sam is trying to do, by lowering the stakes of judicial appointments. And I can talk more about my proposal in the Q&A, but I just want to point out that I think it's an important thing to do. It has to also be combined with a separate act that requires speedy confirmation of judicial nominations, because otherwise you get the kind of hijinks that you got with Merrick Garland. But the combination of a rotation system plus a speedy confirmation act, I think, is the way to go. So that takes me to the last topic I want to talk about, which is constitutional history. And this is an area that I just love, and I could talk about it forever, but we have limited time, so I can't. Let me start at a very broad brush and say that there are three important conceptions of history that have been raised in this conference. The first two are based in myth and religion. The third is the closest to the Enlightenment. It comes from Darwin. It's probably the most scientific, although it also has been used non-scientifically. So the two mythical or religious ones are cyclical and linear. The cyclical comes from the pagans, the ancient Greeks, and the ancient Chinese. The linear is Jewish and Christian. It's eschatological. It sees that history moves from a special point, which is so for Jews, it's from Mount Sinai until the coming of the Messiah, and for Christians, it's from the birth of Christ and his death and resurrection until the end of time in the Last Judgment. It's not surprising these things are linked because of the relationships between these two religions. The third conception of history is path dependence or evolutionary. And this is the idea of history that's articulated by Charles Darwin. Understood properly and not in the way it was sometimes understood, the path-dependent evolutionary conception of history has no sense of progress. It is simply one damn thing after another, structured by and shaped by what came before, sometimes randomly, but basically one thing happens to another caused by what happened before. That's the path-dependent evolutionary model. It is not an accident that Sam, a man of radical hope, adopts the Jewish and Christian messianic mythical vision of linear progress of history, nor is it a mistake that Frank Bowman, a man of the Enlightenment, deeply steeped in respect for science and knowledge and truth, adopts the Darwinian path-dependent and evolutionary model of history. He calls it linear, but his conception of history, when you pay attention to what he says, is not linear. It is path-dependent and evolutionary. And like a good Enlightenment thinker, he has adopted this way, and that's a good thing too. I myself am a fox, not a hedgehog. So in fact, I partake of all three of these conceptions of history. As Sam pointed out, he saw that there was something very strangely linear in my cyclical account. And if he had pressed me more, I would have told him about the path-dependent and evolutionary features of my account as well. So I'm afraid I'm a fox, not a hedgehog. But what Sam did note, and I think entirely correctly, is the pre-modern, and we might even say pagan, conception of history that's baked into this book. And I just want to point out to you that this idea is one of the oldest ideas in humankind. It is mythical, but it's not wrong. That is to say, it is in fact an appropriate way philosophically of thinking about change and about history. So before I wrote this book, several books ago, in 2002, I wrote a commentary and translation, I think a pretty good commentary and only a middling translation of the ancient Chinese book of changes, the I Ching. And this theory, this philosophy, the cyclical philosophy of change is baked into almost every hexagram and moving line of the I Ching. For example, on the back of the book, I have the text of the 11th hexagram, third moving line, which reads something like this. I mean, I don't have the exact translation, but it's roughly like this. There is no plane without a slope. There is no going forth without a return. Do not be saddened about this truth. Enjoy the blessings you possess. That's the saying in that part of the book. Well, what is the I Ching teaching us? Well, the I Ching is teaching us that nothing lasts forever. Winter is eventually coming. You have to keep things going as long as you can. You have to keep the good times going as long as you can keep them, because they won't last forever, and you will be in a period of a failure. You will have to hide your light. There's another hexagram devoted to what you do in a period in which your light is dimmed. That's the hexagram number 36. So this is there's an entire school of philosophy, of Confucian and Taoist philosophy, that were organized around understanding these ideas and understanding these features of change and understanding history. It arises out of a terrible period of Chinese history when the Warring States period, in which there's enormous amounts of human slaughter. It's actually brought on by technological change. Actually, is what brings on the Warring States period, but I won't go into that. But in any case, this is this account of human history and understanding human history, the impermanence of institutions, the impermanence of arrangements, the fact that things change and that you have to try to create institutions that can last as long as possible, that can provide as many benefits as possible while they last. This is a deep philosophical idea. It's not simply pagan. It's not simply pre-modern. I think it speaks to us very much today. And it certainly is part of this book. The linear conception is the messianic conception. It's the conception of Christ's return. It's the conception of the Messiah eventually rising. Depending upon whether you're a pre-millenarian or a post-millenarian, you think that things are going to get terrible before Christ returns, or you think that things are going to get better and better before Christ returns. But either way, you imagine that history is moving in a particular direction. Now, what's interesting about what we call modern or secular conceptions of history is that they have essentially secularized these mythical and religious conceptions. Progress in the secular era tends to confuse scientific and technological progress for moral and political progress. And it is true that we have had tendencies toward greater peace and more peaceful societies, although we've also had terrible carnage and war. But to the extent we've had greater peace, it's come from institutional and economic arrangements that give people incentives to be peaceful, which is why, and not because people have become better people than people lived in the past. And that's why the study of institutions, both economic and political and cultural, is crucial to the promotion and maintenance of peace. So that leads me to the question that was raised many times in the discussion, and that was the question of what are the cycles? The cycles are features of the interaction of human agency with structures and institutions that have been created by past acts of human agency. Human agency, that is freedom in contingent circumstances, creates structure, which channels and limits agency, which in turn changes structure, and so on. So you can see this is cyclical, It's also path dependent. And to make Sam happy, I would also say it has elements of linearity into it too. Now, that raises a very interesting question. If we had different political institutional structures, would we have the same cycles I describe in this book? The answer is yes, we would. We wouldn't have the same cycles. The reason why you have the cycle of regimes, for example, in the United States, is because you have a presidential system with parties, as opposed to a parliamentary system. Parliamentary systems don't have regimes in the same form. When a parliamentary majority loses and the new parliamentary majority comes in, well, you now have an elected dictatorship. And you have a civil service that stays the same over time, but essentially just things are different. The United States is different because it has a party system and first past the post. And that creates durable party majorities over long periods of time. You have a presidential system in which presidential leadership turns out to be extremely important in structuring what a party does and what its commitments are. And each president finds themselves, this is Steve Skowronek's point, burdened with the decisions, good and bad, by their predecessors. And that's what creates the cycle of regimes. The cycle of polarization, too, is shaped by our representation system, and it's shaped by the way our party system works. If we didn't have first past the post, if we had ways that made it possible for third parties to be durable and sustainable, we would have a very different system, and polarization wouldn't work the same way. That's one reason why Lee Drutman recently in a book has argued that we should move toward ranked choice voting. If we had ranked choice voting, and I would also say got rid of the single member district rule in the House of Representatives, this might change the incentives of politicians, especially to engage in strategies of polarization, and it might produce a very different system with a different cycle, but not a cycle of polarization in the form we have. And yet, I want to say that even if we move to a parliamentary system, and even if we move to ranked choice voting, and even if we got rid of the requirement of single member districts in the House of Representatives, and even if we did all these things, even if Sandy and I got together and wrote a new constitution for the United States, the third cycle, which is the cycle of constitutional rot, I think would still exist in some form. And the reason I think it would exist is because the problem of rot is at base a problem of human imperfection, the lust for power, and the increasing forms of distrust that occur in the struggle for power. That is to say, I think the problem of rot is always present, no matter what the constitutional form you have is. Now, the way rot manifests itself, I think, is different. But it's no accident that if you start with Polybius and you go through Machiavelli and through the founders, they all understand that republics are very delicate things. So if you're going to have a republic, even if it's a parliamentary system, you're going to have some form of rot. It's just that the form of rot, the way it happens, will be different in different institutional structures. And the framers designed our Constitution to, as I would say from the standpoint of the Book of Changes, keep the good times going as long as possible, so that, and ride out the bad times until there could be a period of renewal. I think one of the most important features of our system is the staggered system of elections. That is, the president is 4 years, the Senate 6 years staggered, and then you have 2 years for the House, which makes it very difficult for any party or any demagogue, not to mention any names, to get control of all the branches of government, all the levers of power. Power is diffused and spread out. This is something that Sandy sees as a defect in our system. It is a defect, but in another sense, it's also insurance. Insurance against a certain kind of demagoguery, a certain kind of rise of a particular kind of leader who could destroy a republic. If we were in a parliamentary system, we wouldn't do it this way. We'd have to have another set of defenses for republicanism, which would work in different ways and would be subject to different kinds of attacks. Are the cycles I talk about in this book real? Well, they're theoretical constructions. Polarization really has undulated over a long stretch. There's lots of studies on this. It is connected to economic inequality and wealth inequality. Many political scientists have pointed this out. But I do not claim, and I did not claim in this book, that the cycles are fully independent. I don't claim that there are 3 books here. There's only one book. There are 3 cycles. The cycles are related to each other, and each affects the others. So the regime system creates incentives and disincentives for forms of polarization. This is certainly true of the Republican regime from the 1860s to the 1890s, and also from the Reagan regime from the 1980s onward. Polarization and rot are deeply connected, is the point that Sam Moyne made, but they're not the same thing, because you can have polarization in a system and not have severe constitutional rot. This was true in the United States at different points in its history. On the other hand, rot is almost always accompanied by increasing levels of polarization, but other things as well, including the loss of civic virtue in the way that Jonathan described. Does this book predict the future? No, not really. It gives you a set of tools for thinking about our current condition and about where we go from here. It talks about the obstacles you have to overcome and about party coalitions and development. Periodization is always partly illusory because it's really like Heraclitus's river. The political coalitions are always changing. So I'm not one who believes in the idea of realigning elections. I think that political coalitions change slowly. They change in different parts of the country. Eventually, we notice their effects. My view is that the coalition that made the Republican Party the dominant coalition is near its end point, but I can't tell you exactly when it'll end. It's quite clear, it seems to me, that the 2020 elections don't mark the end of the Reagan regime, and that it's going to be with us for a little while longer, but I can't tell you when that's going to happen. The last thing I want to end with is to talk about a theme that was in Jonathan's talk, which I think is very true. Renewal requires mobilization. It requires people to actually be active in politics. One thing that's very important about our period is it's a period of renewed mobilization. Between the end of the 70s, which was also a period of mobilization, from the 80s until about 2010, America was relatively demobilized. And then, starting first on the right with the Tea Party, and then on the left, Black Lives Matter, and the mobilizations following George Floyd's murder, you see significant mobilization. Also the Women's March right after Trump's inauguration. So what we have today is a mobilized public. So we have one ingredient, but you need something else. And this is ironic or sad, however you want to think about it. In order to have true renewal, you also need destruction. That is, you have to clear away the ground, the detritus of the past, in order to build something new over it. One way that can happen is through what Jonathan described, which is catastrophe. Catastrophe can clear away the old ways of doing things and clear ground for the new. If you don't have that sort of catastrophe, then you have to rely on something else to produce destruction. Whether fortunately or unfortunately, it appears that the current president of the United States is the great destroyer. He has destroyed all number of different institutions, norms, and practices. And they will have to be rebuilt again. We can only hope they will not be rebuilt in exactly the same way as before, because then we really won't make any progress. So much is going to depend on political will, that is agency. That is the question that Sam raised, the idea that people have to want to change and believe in the possibility of change, that our institutions are sufficiently plastic, that they can be changed, that we aren't simply bound by structures that have bound us before, that we can have a different world. This is hope. This is optimism. But it's very much like the joke about the psychiatrist and the light bulb. You know, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope you hear all of our audience applauding. Jack, I can't believe you you put that together between 12:20 and 1:05. Amazing.
And I had lunch too. I had lunch.
And you had lunch too. So I'm glad you ended by talking about how renewal can occur. I was once you started talking about how rot seems to just be something that's always going to be with us because of the urge for power. That was going to be exactly my question. How can renewal be possible? But I'm glad that you addressed that. Why don't I give the chance for panelists to jump in and respond and ask questions about your response while I try to help Sandy. Oh, there we go. There's Sandy. Would Guy or Sam Moyne or Amanda, anybody like to jump in and respond to Jack's comments?
Or if there's somebody from the audience.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. Anybody from the audience? We don't have any questions in the Q&A. please, audience members, please feel free to jump in.
I'll bite just because no one else is. That was a bravura performance to begin with. Just on the parts about cyclicality and linearity. I mean, I buy totally that you could have a Darwinian account, and it's very persuasive when you put it that way. That you could kind of reconstruct the deep foundations of what you've done here in those terms, but you also have your normative values, and if the professed goal is hope, there's a tinge of messianism in there, and of course from a modern secular point of view, you'd want to explain yourself as part of the picture you're laying out. Now you do in the book, but just with respect to kind of becoming a liberal originalist at some point within constitutional theory. But it seems like we're entitled to, a broader account of how like you've been produced, not just as someone studying path dependency, but as someone kind of devising this scheme that leads us to be entitled to a certain amount of hope, not too much, etc.
There's something you said, by the way, in your talk that I thought was very astute, although I think you've got the time frame a little bit different. You said, well, this book seems to be written by someone who's reacting to the events of Donald Trump's presidency. I couldn't imagine anybody write it. You're right about that, but I have to tell you that it actually goes back much earlier. It goes back to the 2000 election, which I felt was, as I saw, and I remember the Brooks Brothers riot. I mean, not that this was the most important thing in it, but I remember that moment and thinking, oh my God, one of the two major political parties is going crazy. That was 2000. And as I watched the events from 2000 onward, and Sandy and I knows this well because balkanization began in 2003, right shortly, just before the Iraq War began. People were increasingly worried about George W. Bush's dictatorial, it seems so modest now, tendencies. The torture memos came out. We were very worried about threats to American democracy during his presidency. And this was the period in which balkanization begins. I mean, we start writing. Sandy and I start writing about constitutional crisis and constitutional dictatorship. It's pretty obvious to figure out we're worried about something. That's happening during the second term of Bush's regime. And so there's a sense in which this has been on my mind for 20 years. And that what Trump does is he just makes it, he really just crystallizes the problem in your mind. You start thinking about it. Sandy and I started our book on democracy and dysfunction before Trump's election. As Sandy points out, we both thought there's no way this man's going to be elected president. We're going to write a book about what's wrong with American democracy and what to do about it. And then, of course, he intervenes in the middle of the book. He's a character in the book because he shows up right in the middle. Like, for those of you who know your Isaac Asimov Foundation series trilogy, he's the mule, right? If you remember in the story, Hari Seldon has worked it all out. It's all covering laws, it's all psychohistory, and then the mule shows up and throws everything into disarray. And of course, that's part of the story. So Trump shows up and he throws everything into disarray, and then you have to figure out what to do about it. And the question is he really exceptional? Or in fact, if we trace it back historically, can we see that this was coming from a long time? So yes, this book reflects anxieties I've had about the American experiment in democracy for 20 years. And of course, Trump basically just what's the right metaphor? Accelerates them, throws kerosene on the fire, whatever metaphor you want to use. So I think that was very astute of you, Sam.
So Jack, we have a question from the audience. We have a couple. First question is, thank you for the presentation. Can you talk about the what you see as the alternative to single member districts that you mentioned and the role that could play in improving things? Well,
so Lee Drutman has written a book on this recently, and other folks have made this point. So it's not, there we go, breaking the two-party doom loop. Thank you, Amanda. Amanda, would you join in and help me explain Lee's book after I say a few words about it?
I'm assigning it next semester. So Lee is my colleague from grad school, but don't tell him I haven't read it yet.
Fine. Anyway, the basic idea is you could create a system which, let's suppose there are 5 districts in Missouri. How many districts are there in Missouri? 10? I'm sorry, this is really embarrassing.
How many electoral votes does Missouri have? That's one way of answering the question. And then subtract 2. Does anybody know how many electoral votes Missouri has?
Eight congressional districts.
8 congressional districts. Okay. So suppose Missouri is currently required by federal law to have single member districts, but suppose Missouri got rid of it and said, then you could vote 8 times. You have 8 votes. That's one way of doing it. Or you could rank votes. And so what that means is it's possible to have multiple parties in Missouri. So there might be a party, the Green Party. There might be a Green Party. There might be a Christian Democrat Party. There might be a Libertarian Party. It wouldn't do very well. There might be in Missouri or anywhere really. There might be all sorts of parties, and these parties could be durable. They could form coalitions. They could last, and because they wouldn't all be majority parties, they'd have to form coalitions with other parties. And that would mean there'd have to be a lot of give and take. And so the result would be that it would just not be in your interest to burn your bridges. The Christian Democrat Party does not want to burn bridges with the Greens because there may be something they can work with the Greens on. So right now, the incentive is for evangelical Christians, conservative evangelical Christians, to declare that AOC is the Antichrist, right? Well, maybe, who knows? I haven't looked to see whether the initials, anything's carved in their forehead, but in a different electoral system, evangelical Christians and AOC may see eye to eye on a bunch of issues, and so they may form alliances. That will prevent certain forms of polarization from springing up. That, by the way, Key is an expert in election law. I'll tell you even more about it. That is to say, you can create a different kind of politics if you have a different representational system. We have chosen a representational system that encourages a certain kind of political behavior. That political behavior has now come home to roost. We could have a different representational system.
Yeah, but the we have chosen is the rabbit in the hat. Congress in 1842 made a very sensible decision, given the politics of 1842, to require single-member districts, and that was reaffirmed again for sensible reasons dealing with the civil rights movement in 1967.
Right.
It is a disaster in 2020, but to get rid of single-member districts, I would argue, playing my broken record, that you need a constitutional convention precisely because it is literally unimaginable that the House of Representatives would ever vote to get rid of single-member districts. These are 435 people of both parties who benefit from the current system. If we were California, and I'm one of probably the handful of legal academics who wish that the United States were California, we could do an end run by having an initiative referendum, but we can't do that at the national level. So to talk about, well, if only we could, if only we could change the law, yes, but we can't, given Article 5. And that is the tragic dilemma, which I do think the Yale emphasis on workarounds, kind of leads us to wish to, if not ignore, then to diminish the importance of.
By the way, it's Mark Tushnet who coined the term workarounds. He's at a different school.
No, but Akio has really picked that up as well.
Okay.
So I'm gonna have Tommy's gonna jump in real quick, and then we've got a number of questions in the Q&A that I'll get to. Go ahead,
So
Tommy.
in response to some of the optimism about state constitutional amendments and state constitutional law, I just want to suggest that maybe the only thing worse than being able to change the Constitution is not being able to change the Constitution. So, for example, in Missouri, the Constitution contains a provision that requires ballot question every 20 years on whether to hold a constitutional convention. The next one will be on the ballot in 2022. It hasn't been much used, but the initiative and referendum process in Missouri is pretty often used, and most recently to sort of nefarious ends. In 2018, an initiative would have taken the power to conduct redistricting away from the legislature and given it instead to a nonpartisan demographer. In response to that amendment, which passed overwhelmingly, the Republican-controlled legislature put a referendum on the ballot this election cycle, which undid that prior amendment and cloaked it in language that suggested it was a good government measure as well. So I'm not so convinced that state constitutional amendments are a possible source of hope when they've been with us all along and they've been put to some pretty unfortunate ends as well.
Yeah, actually, Cindy Bass just asked a very similar question about, brought up the very same fact, Tommy. Here's a question from the audience in regards to the relationship of race and class to the cycle of polarization and its connection to rot. Do you see any means that could disarm political actors of the expedient and cynical tool of deliberate scapegoating and actively wielded polarization?
This is related to our earlier discussion. I mean, politicians will have incentives to engage in scapegoating. It's just the way it is. The question is what are the structures they're working through? So what you want is a representational system. Again, this goes back to the question of how we get from there to there, which is Sandy's point, that will encourage the creation of lots of different overlapping coalitions. Those coalitions are most likely not to want to engage in that kind of craziness, precisely because it will come back and bite them later on. I mentioned earlier, by the way, that many of my friends were very dismayed to learn that Donald Trump had increased his support by African Americans and Latinos from 2016 to 2020. And yeah, there is a sense in which that's sad, because he actually isn't been the best president for African Americans since Abraham Lincoln. Actually, this is not true. I don't know if you noticed that, but it does suggest that it may give the right incentives for Republican politicians after Trump. Seeing what's happened, they may say, "Hey, gee, there's something we can do with this," and it will change some of the strategies they use.
Another question is, one of our audience members said, I found the skepticism of political realignments interesting. Could you say more about how political realignments and political regimes might be incompatible? It seems like the idea of regimes that ebb and flow and rise and fall mirrors the idea of personal political views doing the same, with elections acting as demarcations of broad popular change and regime change.
Here's all I mean by this. There was in political science for a long time, Amanda, you can join in if you want to. There was in political science for a long time a theory of realigning elections. Walter Dean Burnham and in my school, Mayhew basically delivered the coup de grace to that theory. He wrote a book on it, Political Alignments. But it isn't clear there are single elections that basically change everything. When we point to elections like 1932 or 1980 or 1968, which is a very important election, but not a realigning election, I guess, or some people say it is. What we're really noticing is how the cumulative effects of gradual changes in party coalitions seem to have had durable consequences. But the political coalitions are constantly changing. Here's an example. In the book, I say, this is not new, original with me, Republicans have been losing women voters. They've been losing college-educated voters. They have been losing voters in the suburbs. 3 examples. If you go back 40 years ago, these are all strong groups for Republicans. They've been losing them. They've been exchanging, for the most part, white, non-college educated and white working class voters for these other voters. Didn't happen overnight. It happened over long periods of time. It gradually, slowly. It had to do with demographic trends. It also had to do with people moving in and out of states and the way that neighborhoods got built. It had to do with city planning and suburban planning. In other words, this was a very gradual process and shifting of generations. That's how things change, not in magical moments of realignment. Realignment is when you wake up and notice that these things have happened, as opposed to actually being the causal effect. That's what I mean when I say I don't buy realignment theory.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on Jack, I think the idea of realigning elections being the most visible evidence, or the first really visible evidence of that realignment. But I think of the white evangelicals moving into the Republican Party and coming out in droves for Ronald Reagan in 1980, which was a realigning election, but that was decades in the making, right? That was several decades of mobilization and grassroots work by folks like Jerry Falwell and Ralph Reed and Pat Robertson. It didn't happen via the election. It was manifested for the first time during that election. So I agree with Jack on this point.
I'm gonna, if it's okay, combine a couple questions that were here. Joshua Braver asks, regimes are systematically set up to stymie their overthrow, to make it harder for new or resurgent political parties to gain power through elections. 3/5 was the problem in the antebellum era. Today it's the Senate, gerrymandering. We thought these could be overcome because of Trump's offensiveness, coronavirus, but it didn't happen. And so even the realistic workarounds you suggest are unlikely to happen soon. So is regime transition increasingly unlikely? Might we just be stuck for the foreseeable future in a period of stagnation, paralysis, and decline until global warming kills us all off?
That is very optimistic. Boy, Joshua, you are an optimist. Boy, I love that. Yeah.
A related question was, can you say a little bit more about why you think the Reagan regime is going to keep going for a while? So obviously they're a little bit...
they're opposite sides of the same question.
Yeah,
So
right.
so what many people imagined would happen, it didn't happen, was that it would be a blowout, that you get lots of electoral votes for Biden. He'd win the Senate, maybe 52, 53. Certainly a lot of the polls were predicting that. Then they would take Manchin from West Virginia, stuff him in a closet, change the rules on filibusters while he wasn't looking. And then they would proceed to admit DC and Puerto Rico. They passed the Voting Rights Act, on and on and on and on and on. I'll do that in like about 6 months, and then boom, new world. So that didn't happen. And instead what you got was, the Democrats are extremely lucky. They may get a 50-50 split in the Senate. And then Kamala Harris will basically have to spend her entire time presiding over the Senate. Not what she intended. And they still won't be able to shove Joe Manchin in a closet because they'll need his vote. So they can't get rid of the filibuster, and they can't do all these things. So even if they win both seats in Georgia, basically a lot of these reforms are not going to occur. So that's the reason I think that we're not seeing a real change. And indeed, if anything, the 2020 election seems to suggest that a lot of Republicans got fed up with Trump, but they didn't get fed up with the Republican Party. They still think the Republican Party is a better bet for what they care about and what they value. This is tied to Jonathan's point earlier about values and what people really believe in, stories. Lots of Americans think that the Republican Party tells a better story about what they care about, why Americans are important, what America stands for, what they want from America. That hasn't changed. Although Trump seems now to be, well, we'll see what happens with him, but he doesn't seem to be the Republican Party anymore. It seems to have an independent existence. So what that means is that the struggle keeps going and the Reagan regime keeps going. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all over. I mean, I don't want to get your hopes up, but I want you to understand Andrew Jackson is not Andrew Jackson in 1828. Andrew Jackson only becomes Andrew Jackson in 1832. And indeed, he's censured by Congress in his first term, which is generally not what you think of as a reconstructive presidency. So, so things can change, but it's really important to understand that we're not at the point that where we can really say we've turned the corner on the Reagan regime. And that leads to Joshua's question, which is simply this: maybe we'll never turn the corner. Maybe, in fact, the entrenchment of Republican power as a minoritarian power, its control of the judiciary, its control of the Senate, its control at local levels and local governments is so great that it can never be dislodged. It's possible. I won't say it's not possible. I do want to say that we don't know yet. But it's certainly not going to happen overnight. I mean, I think that's the lesson of 2020.
Yeah, can I just ask a clarification question? That was a great performance, and Paul definitely should not have given you those extra 5 minutes. That was unfair.
Or else I shouldn't have been able to eat lunch. Yeah, that's true.
Right, pick one or the other. But on this last point, so you still have this theory of a dominant party, right? Sort of like, but it's not clear to me that that's what we actually have. I mean, we have two really closely divided, right, fighting for hegemony. And now you may be right, though, that one way to think about dominance is sort of like who's setting the neoliberal agenda. And if that's true, then okay, then I get you, right? Everybody's reacting to that neoliberal agenda, so therefore the Reagan coalition is the dominant coalition. But outside, and then I see Sam nodding his head, so maybe that's what he's nodding too.
Yeah,
but if
Sam is always saying, yes, it's the damn neoliberals. If we could only get rid of the damn neoliberals, we'd be fine. But you're right, Guy. I think you've got it right. I'll restate it slightly differently, but I think you're basically right. But did you have something else you wanted to add to this?
No. We're short on time.
What does it mean to say that Reagan coalition is still dominant, right? So it's clearly a party that's losing its mojo. It's losing its power, right? Its demographic is shifting underneath it. New voters, young voters, loathe it with undisguised, hatred. How can we say it's still dominant? And the answer is, we are in a period of relatively equal party power, just in terms of electoral power, but we have the hangover of old institutions that have amplified the power of the Republican Party. And you know what they are. They're the Senate and the judiciary and state legislatures. So even though the parties are almost equally, right, they're just fighting, as you said, one of them has a institutional advantage, and the other faces institutional headwinds. And that is the sense in which we could still say that the Republican Party is the dominant party. But you could say, hey, why not use Mark Tushnet's model? We're in a period of interregnum. We're in a period of equally powerful parties scraping for whatever victories they can. And that's a period of nobody being dominant, right? It depends on where you think the agendas lie. So I happen to worry, I don't know what your view is, I'd be interested in your view, that we're likely to see a modus vivendi between Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell. That's going to be the frame of American policy going forward. And that's a neoliberal agenda, it seems to me.
Along those, why don't if I could just let you answer one last question, Jack, or ask you to answer one last question. Goes back, as I mentioned, one of our audience members, Cindy Bassett here, brought up the same fact as Tommy before about how Missouri had chosen a citizen petition to change our redistricting process, but then it was overturned. Those who were in power tried to get it changed and they were successful. How do we make changes when those in power have a sort of a stranglehold on the ability to make that change?
Well, there are only a limited number of ways. One is violent overthrow of the government of Missouri, which I do not recommend. So no one should hurt me to say that I think this is a good idea. It is a bad idea. The other thing is you just keep struggling. You keep struggling until you're able to win. And this happened to the folks in Florida, with felon disenfranchisement, that basically they passed a referendum, they passed an amendment to change felon, and then felon disenfranchisement, and then the Republican legislature poisoned it. I mean, they made it impossible to enforce. And then the Trump appointees on the federal appellate court basically upheld it in what I think was a incorrect interpretation of the 24th Amendment, because it's a poll tax, basically, it's what it is. So whenever you struggle against these kinds of impediments, you shouldn't assume that they will give way easily. These impediments, this is, the famous line from Frederick Douglass, is that power concedes nothing without a fight. And I would simply add, power concedes nothing without fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting.
Well, thank you. I think that's actually a good note for us to end on. And let me just say, I'm glad that you've had the last word here, Jack, and when you have a book that does express some hope for our future, and then you have people commenting on it, usually people are going to emphasize their areas of disagreement. So you get a lot of comments about questioning about the reasons for hope for the future. So I'm glad that you had the last comment here to inspire us and move forward. I want to thank you so much. For me, at least, this has been the highlight of my semester. These last 2 days of discussion just been absolutely rejuvenating in terms of our discussion about scholarly ideas and about current events. It's just been absolutely wonderful. To all of our commentators and panelists and moderators, thank you so much. I really, my expectations were very high and they were easily exceeded. I'm so thrilled with the entire 2 days of discussion. It was just fabulous. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to Jack. Thank you to everyone in the audience. This has just been really, really wonderful.
Bye, guys. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.